Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 2, The U.S. Economy, A Global View. Countries have different economic outcomes, and as we talked about in Chapter 1, each country has to decide what they're going to produce, how they're going to produce it, and for whom they're going to produce it. Since each country has different abilities, different resources, each country has to make its own decisions in how to allocate those resources and how to answer those questions. Some make these decisions at the government level, other countries make the decisions at the market level. In this chapter, we're going to focus on the United States. The first question to be answered is, what is produced? The United States is the largest producer of goods and services in the world. It's also the largest consumer of goods in the world. Many people say, well, isn't China the biggest producer of goods in the world? They may very well be, but we produce a tremendous amount of services, and we've really become a service economy. So when it comes to goods and services, the U.S. is number one. We'll talk more about the service economy later on in this chapter. The United States specializes in producing what it can produce at a lower opportunity cost than other countries. And finally, the United States purchases from other countries goods and services that they can produce at a lower opportunity cost than the United States. Okay, we're very good at that last one. What that basically means is that if another country can do something cheaper, we let them. And there's a lot of discussion about this in the last presidential election, about saying we need to keep the production here and not let it go other places. But that's really an economically uninformed point of view. Because what happens is, we'll take Nike as an example. If Nike can can sell a pair of shoes for $50, actually if it's Nike's, let's say $100, and that same pair of shoes costs them to produce it $10 in China, they can make a $90 profit, and that $90 would be just on cost of goods sold. There would also be the marketing and the overhead and everything else, and the distribution and the cut for the final reseller. So it's not a truly $90 profit, but a $90 gap between sales price and manufacturing cost. Or if they were to make that same pair of shoes here, it would probably cost them $20. Well, in order to still get that $90 gap, they would have to push their price to $110. So by allowing products to be produced overseas, we as the consumer can get cheaper products. And in spending less money on products allows us to buy more products, which allows us to keep the economy moving forward by producing and purchasing more volume. Our money's being spread out to more places, which supports more businesses. So it's really helped our economy to have these lower priced items. We're going to talk more about this as what America produces. This is the gross domestic product. This is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's border within a given period of time. The GDP measures the economy size. This is the sum of every dollar spent in the course of a year, is another way to look at this. The US GDP is about a quarter, 25% of the world's GDP. And we're about twice as big as the next largest GDP. This is a very important number, and it really is the measure of the size and strength of an. If we divide GDP by population, we get an indication of the country's living standard. That's the per capita GDP. This is the GDP divided by the population. If the GDP grows faster than the population grows, the standard of living rises. If the GDP grows slower than population grows, the standard of living falls. Well, let's talk about GDP growth a little bit. First of all, the per capita GDP in the United States has gone up quite a bit. And well, maybe not in the last couple of years, but historically. And the GDP has grown faster than the population in the United States, which has accounted for the drastic increase in the standard of living in this country. Remember that we actually have a government program set up to address obesity in our poor. I mean, let's think about that for a second. We are having to spend money for the government to research why our poor people are obese. I don't know if I would categorize them as poor if they have enough access to food to actually be obese. But we consider them poor because our standard of living has gotten so high. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, our economy does grow fast. We are the biggest economy in the world. The other is our population grows very slowly. I mean, when you consider that in terms of resource and size, we're right on par with a China and an India, and they're both over 1 billion people, and we're still at 300 million. We are actually not, our birth rate is so low, we're not replacing ourselves, which is an amazing thought, that each woman actually needs to have 2.1 children in order to replace her and her partner. So that's the replacement rate, 2.1 children per woman. We're at about 2.05, and we've been below that at other times. That means that we are not replacing ourselves. Europe is far worse. They're well below 2 in many countries. And the reason, well, we can guess as to the reasons why we're not replacing ourselves. But the only way our population grows, and if you track our population, or if you've ever looked at a graph, we are still slowly growing, is immigration. People coming from other countries, mainly through legal immigration. We have about 1 million a year legal, when it comes to legal immigrants, and about 250,000 a year illegal immigrants that come into this country. That's how our population is growing, rather than through people having more children. So that's one of the reasons our standard of living has stayed so high, is because our GDP is able to stay ahead of population growth because of the low population growth. Now on to the GDP growth slide. Economic growth is an increase in output and expansion of production possibilities. The U.S. has grown roughly 3% per year, while population has grown about 1% per year. Once again, raising per capita GDP. And we'll talk more about how we get that 3%. So if we look at this, the total output of real GDP since 1900 to 1910, through 2010, versus the population growth. And you can see that huge gap, and that's why our standard of living is so high. That's why we have programs for obese and our poor. In other countries, poverty means starving to death and true hunger. And we've all seen the pictures, and maybe many of you have been to these truly poor countries. In this country, there are resources available for even the poorest of the poor. The poorest of the poor can have government resources available to them and can still live a fairly high quality of life. It's really an interesting time in the history of the world to be alive, because if you're in this country, there's really no such thing as true poverty unless you choose to ignore the resources available to you. Rich nations and poor nations. GDP per capita figures are very different in rich and poor nations. In rich nations, populations grow slowly, so GDP per capita increases. Once again, the standard of living increases. Europe has this in that many of their replacement rates are 1.3, 1.4, and they don't have the immigration that we do. So their populations are actually decreasing, and their GDPs are staying stable, which once again means your per capita GDP is growing. And so the standard of living has gone up dramatically in many European countries. Of course, the downside for them in having these shrinking populations is there aren't enough people to pay taxes to fund the pensions of the retiring folks, and that's why you have the economic crisis in Europe right now. In poor nations, population increases rapidly, making it difficult to raise living standards. Very true. In many poor countries, you'll have a replacement rate where we're at 2.05 right now in the US. You'll have replacement rates of 3 and 4. And so the population grows dramatically. And once again, for the GDP to grow at that rate is pretty much impossible. So that's why many of the poor nations stay poor.